Thank you very much, Chairman, and again, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, delighted to be here. The 15 minutes that I've been allocated will be, for me, an opportunity to give you an update on what is happening on road safety in the European Union. In a way, we left it here 1 year ago when we were busy with the new strategy, with the Infrastructure Safety Directive, with the General Safety Directive, and the aim of the presentation today will be to tell you a bit more how we're doing in terms of statistics and also how we're doing in terms of policy. We'll not talk too much about that because I already mentioned the very active role of the Traffic Safety Agency of the Republic of Srpska, but also to say that I see many familiar faces in the audience, representatives from the agency in Slovenia, in Serbia, and of course the European Federation of Road Traffic Victims. This slide is about the activities of the European Transport Safety Council, and most of the knowledge base which we have is actually coming from these various projects. Jonathan has mentioned it very well. The daily scandal, if I may, of complacency when it comes to road traffic deaths. And what we really do not accept is this complacency. We do not accept that anything that has to do with earthquakes, flooding, collisions in aviation, in rail, does get a reaction from the public opinion, from the press. And this is not the same when it comes to road safety and when it comes to road deaths, just because the deaths are scattered all around Europe, all around the world. And these are the figures for the European Union. And you know, by listening to what Jonathan said, it is clear that the situation is much better in the European Union. And the European Union, if you go and talk in the circles of road safety, is considered a success story. So 25,000 people dying every year on our roads, we still consider it a success story. Well, for us it's not a success, for us it's a failure. It's a failure because as long as we will have this continuous strategy on our roads, well, we will not be able to rest, we will not be able to be complacent and understand that, that there is still too much to do before before being able to dedicate our efforts to other activities. I'm not sure we can see this graph very well. It doesn't matter. That gives me the opportunity to go quicker. It was a graph showing actually the European curve of reduction over the last decade. The European Union has a target to reduce by half the number of people who are dying on European roads between 2011 and 2020. Here you see a breakdown, but the most important figures are the one you see at the bottom of the slide. The desired EU 28 progress towards the target, which was 42.6% at this time of the decade, and the actual one, the EU average reduction over these first 8 years of the decade, which has only been 20.7%. Therefore, the conclusion is that the European Union is stagnating in terms of reduction of road safety. We're not doing as well as we should be doing, and the target, I'm afraid, will not be met. This is, on the other hand, an analysis of the situation of road mortality in the European Union. We said the European Union is still considered a success story, but you also see how talking about the European Union makes sense only to a limited extent, because the countries are very different between one another. You have countries that have less than 28 deaths per million inhabitants, and those who have almost 100 deaths per million inhabitants. And this is the same graph, but viewed in a different way, with a background, an analysis for the various countries. Jonathan also mentioned the importance of not only dealing with road deaths, but taking care of the survivors as well. And this is the latest data that we have by the European Union, not for all countries, and also we believe it to be highly underestimated. What will happen for the future? We're still very much relying on the Valletta Declaration, which was signed by the various ministers of transport and by the European Commission. And it's a declaration that politically is very important for the European Union, because irrespective of the stagnation that we are experiencing, well, is still very committed in having new targets, is still very committed in target-based road safety work. And for the next decade, we will not only have the renewal of the death reduction target, but for the first time ever, we will also have a target to reduce by half the number of road safety injuries between, road traffic injuries between 2020 and 2030. In terms of legislation, there are two pieces of legislation that have just been completed, so this really represents a clear improvement to what we've been discussing from this stage last year, when these two pieces of legislation were still work in progress. The first one is the EU General Safety Regulation, and basically this is an exclusive competence of the European Union. It means that the European Union will decide in Brussels the way vehicles will have to be built for the future, and all the 28 member states will have to adapt to this regulation, will have to make sure that they respect this regulation. And these are just some of the measures that have been approved back in May this year. And amongst others, well, you'll see those that apply to all vehicles, like intelligent speed assistance. I'll say more about that. The facilitation for the installation of alcohol interlocks when this is needed, the warnings for distraction and drowsiness, emergency stop signal, and then those that are common to cars and vans, and those like direct vision and vulnerable road user detection warning, which are only applicable to trucks and buses. These are now to be published on the official journal of the European Union, and they are legislation. And this piece of regulation has a huge safety potential. Studies from independent experts in the UK, from the TRL, the Transport Research Laboratory, well, indicate that thanks to this new piece of legislation, the European Union will be able, in the first 15 years of implementation, to save as many as 25,000 deaths. And speed is, I would say, one of the measures that the new piece of legislation tackles more effectively, and it does so via the mandatory equipment from 2022 on of this new technology called intelligent speed assistance, which means that all new vehicles will have to have a system that is capable of recognizing speed limits via GPS, via cameras on their rear view mirrors, and will help the driver to respect these speed limits. intelligent speed assistance will now be mandatory on all new models of vehicles already in 2022, and for the current models that are already in production, well, ISA will have to be installed as of 2024. As you can see in the slide, I would like to stress that for the time being, this is a system that will be certainly on by default each time you turn the engine on. It can be overridden if there is a need, if, for example, the speed limit that is indicated is not the same as the one that you can see on the road. But even though it is still overrideable, we believe that this is an incredible advance when it comes to reducing speed on European roads. The other piece of legislation which was recently completed is the amendment of the Road Infrastructure Safety Management Directive. Well, this was a directive already in existence which mandated the use of these 4 instruments to the so-called Trans-European network. And the revision of the General Safety Directive, also approved last spring, has some very important, I would say, improvements to the previous text. First and foremost, the directive will not only apply to the Trans-European network, but to what the legislator has called primary roads. Primary roads will be the subject of a national definition by each of the member states, but certainly we will encourage, and the Commission will encourage member states to have as wide as possible a definition of what are primary roads. There will be a network-wide safety assessment, but also for the first time, the 4 instruments of the directive will have to closely take into account also the safety of vulnerable road users. So one of the traditional criticisms to road infrastructure managers has always been that roads are built with car drivers in mind. Well, this directive makes sure that when it comes to the roads that are covered by the legislation, well, we will need also to cater for the safety of vulnerable road users. And also, I do encourage to look at this other document, which is the EU Road Safety Policy Framework for the next decade. This has been also recently published, and apart from containing the 2 new targets, it's got a lot of interesting measures and considerations coming from the European Commission, including for the first time ever the development of 8 key performance indicators that will allow member states to collect these indicators and to give us advanced warning on where the Union is going when it comes to indicators, and obviously as a consequence also to developments in road safety. Something that I would also like to mention before I conclude is that another piece of legislation is up in line now for amendments. This is the driving license directive, and it is not for tomorrow. It will probably be, the process will be starting in a couple of years from now, but it is an amendment which will need to take into account other considerations which were not covered by previous legislation. And for us, it is also extremely important that the new directive on driving license can also take into account the importance of the evolving nature of the cars and of the drivers. For example, cars will now have new technologies. It is important that the driver training takes into account how the driver will have to interface with these technologies, but also we slowly moving towards more and more automated driving, which eventually, probably not straight away, not in the next decade for sure, will lead to fully automated driving and an updated driving license directive will certainly also need to take this into account. But it is not for now, as I said. Driving license directive is probably a subject which we'll be able to discuss more in the years to come, so probably in future editions of this conference. Thank you very much.